Yeah, so I will start sharing my screen. And yeah, we were saying if you want to put questions in the chat, I'm not going to monitor the chat while I'm talking, but Conrad can sort of keep an eye on it, and then maybe afterwards we'll do the question and answers, and Conrad can call people up and ask them to ask their questions.
But can people also just, are you okay if people just pipe right in?
Yeah, we could do that too. Yeah, you can just unmute yourself and ask a question while we go. We can do that as well. And Conrad, will you record the presentation?
As we
no. Okay, then we better get started. All right, I'll share my screen and see if this all works good. Oh, that's weird. Wait. Screen. And do this. All right, can you all see my screen?
Not yet.
Nope.
Uh-oh. And why is that? All right. Conrad, do you have to allow me to share the screen? I mean, I have the share screen thing down here and I'm clicking it and nothing happens.
I don't think so, because you were, I mean, we actually tested this before. Allow, record, rename, put in reading.
This is April Fool's.
What was that?
This is April Fool's Day. Someone's
right. Yeah. Shall I leave and come back in? Is it back to the track?
Now we see it.
Great. Thank you. All right, after this little interruption, let's see, we'll do this. Okay, so today I will share with you our experiences of 4 years of establishing and managing and monitoring native meadows that we are working on at the Hudson Valley Farm Hub. And let's see. My click forward worked when I first tried this, and now that's not doing anything. Yes. So the Hudson Valley Farm Hub is located on the other side of the river, just outside the town of Kingston. Here's Kingston. And it's stretching out 1,500 acres along the Esopus Creek, which comes out of the Ashokan Reservoir and goes into the Hudson. And an aerial view gives you an idea of those amazing agricultural soils, flat, beautiful silt soil. And the Esopus Creek is right here in those woods. And the Farm Hub, which is a nonprofit organization, has decided to retire some of the agricultural fields that are right next to the river because they're very flood prone. But they didn't want them to completely grow back into forest. And so we had the opportunity to experiment with different seed mixes to see what kind of perennial but low herbaceous cover we can establish that would attract pollinators, beneficials, support other insects and invertebrates, and just bring a little bit more biodiversity overall onto the farm. So the goals of our native meadow trials, specifically in terms of the botanical and management questions, are to find out what does it take in terms of equipment, labor, and the cost of seeds to establish and maintain perennial meadows that are composed mostly of native grasses and wildflowers on former cornfields. And is that possible to do without the use of herbicides? and with techniques that are potentially practical to other farmers. And then which plant species seem most suitable as components of these permanent meadows at the Farm Hub and perhaps elsewhere in the Hudson Valley. And then what is the composition and abundance and diversity of flowers that's produced by these meadows across the seasons and over the years? And we have a bunch of other questions that we're also asking in those meadows, but I'm not going to address those in my talk today. They have to do with how the soil conditions are evolving underneath the meadows and how other wild organisms are reacting to or interacting with the different meadows. So we have people looking at insects, and Conrad, Dylan, and Kenny are going to present on the insect part at the next open house, the beginning of May. We have a professor from SUNY New Paltz looking, no, from SUNY Cobleskill looking at the soil macroinvertebrates. We have a professor from Bard looking at soil microbes. And Conrad will talk next open house also about how the crops next to the meadows are reacting to or interacting with the different types of meadows. So it's a collaborative project that a lot of people are contributing to, and it's very exciting and fun. So in establishing the meadows, we collaborated with Kelly Gill from the Xerxes Society, who works with the Natural Resource Conservation Service to provide technical service to farmers who wish to establish habitats for beneficial insects on their farms. And for her, it was a nice opportunity to try out some things. And for us, it was great that we could tap into her expertise. And one of the reasons why we wanted to do those native meadows is because it is one of the possibilities where farmers can actually receive cost sharing from the Natural Resource Conservation Service through their Environmental Quality Incentive Program. And while the Farm Hub did not apply for this support, it is something that's being done out there, and is often done with a lot of herbicides involved, and we wanted to show or test whether you could actually do that without herbicides as well. So the setup for our experiments is we have 3 squares that are 200 by 300 feet in dimension and subdivided into 3 subplots. We call them plot A, B, and C. And the plot A was seeded with a seed mix A, which I'm going to elaborate more on quickly soon. The plots B were seeded with seed mix B, and the plots C were left unseeded and just allowed to behave like a fallow field and grow into whatever wanted to grow from the seeds that were in the seed bank in the soil and that were flying in from the surrounding areas. And my little red dots show our sampling plots where when I'll show you later on the graphs about plant composition and flower abundance, that's where we take those data. We basically walk through all 3 of the plots and stop every 7 or 8 steps and take certain data and then move on and then take our averages from what we've observed to create nice graphs that I will show you later on. So here are portraits of the 22 native wildflowers that we have included in the seed mix A, which we call the wildflower rich seed mix. There's also 1 native grass, little blue stem, and we cheated a little bit because the farmers had some annual flowers, nectar flowers, seeds left over. We threw them on to have some flowers in the first year from those annuals, but you will see in the charts later on, they popped up very quickly and disappeared very quickly again. And now we're sort of developing our long-term meadows out of this pool of perennial native plants that we seeded. And then the seed mix B was less rich in flowers, so we call it the grass-rich seed mix. It has 8 native grasses and only 6 native wildflower species. And again, we threw those annuals in for the first year but they have all since disappeared. And if you're interested, here are the actual lists of the species with their common name and Latin name, and what % of the seeds was composed of each species. And I will share at the end a link to the report that I have written that tells you in more detail than you ever want to know what we have been doing, and those lists are in there if you're interested in studying them in more detail. So first I want to go into a little bit more detail about the management of the native meadow trials, how we established them, and how much work it has taken to maintain them over the first 4 years. That is important because if we want to tell farmers that this is a good idea to do, the first question, well, the first question is probably going to be how much does it cost in dollars, and the second question is how much does it cost in labor and equipment too. So we're keeping track of all that so we can share that. So just briefly, our meadows were established on former cornfields. One of those fields had gone through a year of vegetable growing prior to establishing the meadows, but all of them the year before the seeding, which happened in May 2017. So in 2016, all the meadows were in a cover crop of rye. And then in the fall, the rye was plowed under and they were seeded. No, I'm getting confused. Yes, they were seeded into oats. And the idea was that the oats would winter kill and we would have bare soil in the following spring to seed our wildflowers into. That did not quite pan out. The rye had already seeded in the fall and was coming in again in the spring. And so there had to be three passes with the harrow to pull up all the rye that was volunteering to actually get a bare soil seed bed. And then the seeds were seeded with this nifty machine here. It's a no-till Great Plains seeder that actually has 3 different containers for different sizes of seeds. So we mixed our small seeded species, the medium-sized seeded species, and then the grass species that have a lot of fluff on them. And they got put into 3 different containers in that seeder, and then they got inserted into the soil in these little shallow grooves. And while I have this chart up, I can show you, so the first year when we seeded, we also mowed 3 times during the growing season to discourage the weeds that were coming up from going to seed and to give our little seedlings that were starting to germinate some light to actually establish themselves. So that was relatively management intensive. And so 11 person hours per acre were expended that first year. And I should say that the green bars give you the labor that was applied to our entire experiment, including the control plots. And then the red bars show only the labor that needed to be applied to the seeded plots, because that's really what's relevant if somebody wants to replicate this and seed a native meadow. They don't need to worry about control plots, so they want to know how much management needs to go into the seeded meadows, and those are the red bars. And so you can see for the first 3 years, the management went down. We took a very hands-off approach the first 2 years. Just a little bit of weeding in the second season, a little bit of weeding the third season, and then you will see later the cottonwood seedlings were getting pretty dense because we are in a floodplain and those meadows really want to be floodplain forest. And then we decided that we actually had to mow in the spring the meadows to cut back the cottonwood seedlings so they wouldn't grow into trees. And also mugwort was coming in pretty strongly, and we had to do some selective weeding of mugwort that fourth year, 2020. That's why the management effort went up again. So these are more of the details. I don't think that's also in the report. If you're interested, you can see what exactly we were doing. But let me show you some pictures of what it actually looked like over the years. Basically, I took pictures every month almost from this location of our plot A that was seeded with the seed mix A in this area here. And you can see during the first year, so before the harrowing, that's all the rye that was covering the field. And then after the harrowing, we had bare soil, and on May 19th, the meadow was seeded. And then in June, it was still pretty much bare soil, but then by July, it had filled in nicely. And you can see this first year, we kept the meadow very short, mowed it 3 times, and then at the end of the season, let it go. And we got a few flowers, but very few. And then we let it stand into the winter so that insects could overwinter in there, be undisturbed. And in October of that first year, these were some of the flowers that we got. So the purple one is mist flower, and then we have black-eyed Susan, and then this is blanket flower, which is one of those annuals that came in the first year, but then disappeared very quickly.
Wait, it came in?
And then in the second year, you can see in April, there was all the dead vegetation from the prior year, and then it greened up nicely. In June, we had a big flush of flowers of lance-leaf coreopsis. In July, we had a big flush of flowers of black-eyed Susan. And then in September, we had a little bit of a flush of the asters, New England aster. Then again, we let the vegetation stand into the winter, didn't mow it down so that the insects had space to hide. And these are some of the flowers that we had seeded that came in that second year. So it was quite a nice variety. And then the fourth year, still we had not mowed it at all. The beginning of the fourth year, they came out of their third winter with standing vegetation, but then in March of last year, they got mowed because of the cottonwoods. And then the cycle started again, and you can see flower abundance overall was less than during that second year, but you will see in the charts that I'm gonna show soon that flower diversity was actually quite nice. So that's sort of giving you a first impression of what one of the meadows looked like. Yeah, and that was in August of 2020. The wild bergamot was really taking over. So when we look at a comparison of the species composition in the seed mix, what was originally put on the land in Mix A in 2017, and what the vegetation was actually composed of 4 years later, last year, you can see that 8 species that are circled here in red and include lance-leaf coreopsis, partridge pea, wild bergamot, showy goldenrod, black-eyed Susan, purple coneflower, New England aster, and early goldenrod were the ones that really established themselves well and started taking up quite a bit of space. So in the original seed mix, they made up 36% of the seeds. But after 4 years, when you look at the percent cover of the vegetation that's actually taking up space in the meadow, those 8 species basically composed 88% of the meadow. So from our 22 species that we put on there, 8 really took over, and we'll see how it continues, but that's how it looks at this point. And when you look at how the vegetation developed over the years, on the left side, this is the average of the 3 plots that had been seeded with our flower-rich seed mix A. You can see in July 17, the first year, the seeded plants only made up 10% of the cover in that plot. And they were still pretty evenly distributed. The second year, already 70% of the meadow was covered by seeds, by plants that had grown from the seeds that we had seeded. And it was dominated by black-eyed Susan and lance-leaf coreopsis. Then in the third year, 90% of the meadow, and in the fourth year, 100% of the meadow were covered by the seeds that we had seeded. And you can see how the composition of the different species within the vegetation continues to evolve. And how black-eyed Susan, which is orange, and the lance-leaf coreopsis, which is yellow, are becoming less over the years. And the purple wild bergamot is becoming more common. And I'm curious to see, we're hoping to continue this experiment for another 5 years, or 6 years, so that we have 10 years of it, whether in the end wild bergamot will take over the whole meadow, or whether something will kick in and it will reduce and other species will become more common. And then on the right side is basically the same data, but split up between those 3 different plots that were all seeded with the same seed mix. And that's just to show you that even between the different plots that we seeded with the same seed mix, there's quite a bit of variation how the vegetation has developed over those years. And then these are charts, the same type of chart from the same plots, but now it's the wild growing species. So not the seeded plants, but the wild growing plants, the weeds. So you can see that on average, 70% of the seeded plots in the first year were actually covered by weeds, which made me very worried that the whole thing was a failed experiment. But Kelly encouraged me and said, no, don't worry, just wait, second and third year, they're gonna come through. And sure enough, by the second year, the wild growing plants were less than 20%. And by the third and fourth year, they were below 10%. So, and it's interesting to see who the wild growing plants are that are persisting, and you can see that half of them are tree seedlings. So it's definitely wanting to become a forest, and our management will be trying to avoid that to happen. So, and now I want to just briefly show you a similar set of photos taken from the ground over the years, comparing the development of the 3 plots that were seeded with seed mix A to illustrate a little bit more the differences in development. So during the first season, this is June, July, September, and November of the first year. You can see that plot number 1 was sort of our ideal plot. It grew the most of the seeded plants. The NMT, we call them NMT, that's Native Meadow Trial 2A. By the end of the season, was really dominated by crabgrass, and I was afraid that nothing else could ever grow there. And NMT3 had a wet spot where nothing grew in the first year. So that was interesting too, and a little bit worrisome. But then the second year, so again, June, July, August. Seed, but which is a native plant, so it's kind of sorry guys, I will share my screen again. Somehow I got disconnected.
Your audio is dropping out too, Claudia. Can everybody want to test that again?
But is my audio on now?
I lost you for a while there.
Sorry, when did you lose me?
When you just started talking about this slide.
Okay, good. So we are in the second season, and I was saying that the area that had been overgrown by crabgrass the prior fall actually was mulched nicely by the crabgrass, and then the seeded perennials grew right through it. So it was not a big deal. And also, oops, hang on. There, and the wet spot in NMT3 filled in nicely and was also no problem. So this is to encourage you that if you do a wildflower seeding and it doesn't look great the first year, don't despair. There's a saying that Kelly Gill taught me. She said the first year those native meadows sleep, the second year they creep, and then the third year they leap. So one has to be a little bit patient when establishing them. Yeah, and so this is the fourth year. The differences have evened out, and in terms of structure, those meadows look very similar. But when you go in and look at the species composition, obviously, as I showed you, there are a little bit of differences to the left. So what might account for some of the plot-to-plot differences in the establishment of those native meadow seed mixes? We definitely have a little bit of variation in soil between our trial areas. There's one area that's very sandy. So that's, I think, made a difference. Then there was a little bit of different crop histories. The area that had been in vegetables had clearly a different weed seed bank. And then also, it always looks like when you have those amazing agricultural machines and doing your seeding, it all looks so standardized, but I think there was definitely some uneven seeding happening, and that might also have influenced how the vegetation developed. Plus, weather also might accentuate some of the differences that are in the soil. So some soils might be more prone to respond to extreme weather. So when it got very dry, the sandy soil responded more to that than the silty soils. So those are other things to keep in mind. And then seed mix B, that's our grass-rich seed mix. In the fourth year, it looked like that, very nice tall grass prairie-like situation. And this is a very complex slide. Conrad said, I definitely have to work on this one, but this is what I have for now. So first, let's just look at the left side and compare the two pie charts on the left. The first one is the composition of seeds in the seed mix that was thrown onto these plot B meadows. And 81% of the seeds were native grasses, 6% of the seeds were black-eyed Susan, and then some of the other species. And then when you look down, what the vegetation after 4 years was in those grass-rich meadows was that 50% of the vegetation was actually composed of grasses, 29% was black-eyed Susan. We still had almost 20% bare ground, which was interesting. So this is also to show that the exact seed mix that you're throwing onto a piece of ground might not be all that relevant. Certain plants will take off and other ones will not. Of course, we try to predict which ones are doing well, and that's part of this exercise. But yeah, that's also one of the variations that one just has to expect when one does these seedings. And then when you look at of the 81% seeds that were grasses, there were 8 grass species that were relatively evenly distributed within the seed mix. So there were similar amounts of those 8 grass seeds in the seed mix. But then when you look at what is actually growing after 4 years in terms of the grasses, it's 5 species that basically make up all of those 50% of the grasses, or all of the 50% vegetation in those grass-rich mixes that are actually grasses. And so our most successful grasses were the switchgrass, Indian grass, big blue stem, Canada wild rye, and autumn bent. So that's, in future seed mixes, that's probably the only grasses that we're going to put in there, and we'll forget about the ones that didn't do so well. And then similar charts for those grass-rich seed mixes. Again, slow to take off in the first year. Only 10% of the vegetation was composed of actually seeded plants, but then quickly it filled in. First with black-eyed Susan and lastleaf coreopsis, and then slowly the green are the grasses. They are starting to fill in, and again, quite a bit of variation. This here is the sandy plot, and the grasses are still having a hard time really establishing themselves, even after 4 years in the sandy plot. And black-eyed Susan is still dominating. And similar with the weeds, first year, lots of weeds, and then they plop down, and some variation as well. And then the control plots, which are basically our fallow fields, this is what they look like, or one of them looks like after 4 years. And of course, for the control plots, we don't have charts how the seeded plants were doing because we didn't seed any in them. But this is how the wild plants have filled in, and they have still not filled in completely. There's still some bare soil left. And again, a lot of variation, actually the most variation between the 3 control plots. One of them has a lot of tree seedlings, that's this one. And the other this one has a lot of horseweed and other wild species. And this one has still a lot of lamb's quarters, also horseweed, and some tree seedlings. So depending on how close the plots are to the river and how sandy the soil is, the cottonwood is more or less dense. But when we look at the flower diversity, so this is now the total number of species in flower that we found in the meadows that were established from seed mix A, the flower-rich seed mix, in the grass-rich seed mix, and in the control plots. You can see that over those 4 years, the planted species in seed mix A maxed out already in the 2nd year, and then they sort of came down a little bit and seemed to be plateauing just around 13 species, 14 species of those 22 that we seeded are actually there in enough numbers and big enough to produce flowers. And in mix B, the seeded species, the planted species have gone up. Actually, there must be a mistake here. I need to look into this. This is not right, because we only had 6 flowering species that we planted in seed mix B, and this one shows 8 flowering. So there's a mistake here, my apologies. But basically, because we had very few seeds that actually produce flowers, we didn't have very many plants establishing that are producing flowers. And then you see the planted species in the control plot are actually starting to creep in because they're starting to disperse from the neighboring seeded meadows, and also because last year when all the meadows got, or all the experimental plots got mowed, unfortunately we did not make it clear to the person who was driving the mower that they should mow them in a way that the seeds don't get spread from one experiment to the other. And he mowed across the experiments several times. And so we got a little bit of contamination here. But what I really wanted to show you with this chart is that the total number of species, which are the blue bars that are flowering, are actually still going up in the control plots. because there's a lot of diversity in different plants that are coming in. None of them are very common, but they're providing a nice smorgasbord of floral resources to insects. While our grass leaf seed mix, not surprisingly, is going down in terms of the variety of flowers, and our wildflower rich seed mix is sort of, we're not quite sure. It's still going back and forth, and we'll see where it ends up. But the controls are definitely competing in terms of flower diversity. Now, and I just again show you a few slides taken now from seed mix A, seed mix B, and control plot next to each other over time. And you can see the first year, no big difference between what was seeded or if anything was seeded. The second year, big difference, basically very few flowers in the control plot, lots of flowers both in the seed mix A and seed mix B. But then in the fourth year, the seed mix B actually has a lot less flowers, especially in the fall. You can see there's a lot of asters and goldenrods coming in, and in the late season, seed mix B has no flowers left at all anymore. And control plots, very few flowers. And so this is my last really dense chart to share with you. This is flower abundance now, focusing on seed mix A, our wildflower rich seed mix. And this is the second season. We did not measure flower abundance in the first season because we kept the meadows mowed low and there were very few flowers. So we have the second season, third season, and fourth season. And the different colored lines indicate the abundance of flowers contributed by these species. And the black line on top of it all is the total flower abundance when you add up the flowers of all the different species. And you can see in the second year, we had a lot of flowers early in the summer, and then it dropped down, and unfortunately we stopped documenting the flowers in mid-September, and we realized later that we probably should have continued. There might have been another little peak later in the season, but we did not document that. And then the third year, you can see that the peaks are shifting. The black-eyed Susan was flowering a little bit later than in the second year. The monarda, the wild bergamot, might have also flowered a little bit later, although our field days were a little bit different too. So I wouldn't give too much emphasis to this. But overall, the peak of flowering, because wild bergamot made so much more flowers and black-eyed Susan was making a lot less flowers, the peak of flowers was definitely later in the summer than during the second year. And then the third year, we decided to document later into the fall, and we caught that second peak. So we definitely have a bimodal flower abundance distribution here. And also between the third year and the fourth year, the peak of flowering of black-eyed Susan and wild bergamot shifted 2 to 3 weeks earlier because it was such a dry early summer last year that I think what happened was that they basically tried to do the same pattern as the year prior, but because it was so dry, they basically cut their flowering short and just started wilting. And so we have these peaks that were earlier in the season. But also notice that my vertical axis is actually not to scale. So this one goes from 0 to 100%, this from 0 to 40, and then this one from 0 to 25. So the height of the peaks is not comparable. But then in order to compare the height of the peaks, I also made this chart here. where now the vertical axis goes from 0 to 100, and it shows how in mix A, which are these first three here, the flower abundance really went down over the years, but also the total flower abundance spread out more across the season. And then mix B, in comparison, it has its early peak of the black-eyed Susan, and it's also getting less and less over the years, and not much happening later in the season. And then the flower abundance, the total flower abundance in the control plots is comparatively negligible. You can neglect it compared to what's happening in A and B. So, so that's interesting, and I'm really curious to see how that continues over the coming years, whether there's going to be sort of a base level of flower abundance that it lands on, that every year you can count on so many flowers, or whether it continues to go down, which would be sort of an aging process in the meadow. And that gives interesting questions about, well, if you establish a wildflower meadow, how long can you actually hope it to give you flowers? And yeah, so those are all questions that we will hope to answer a few years later. And then this is just giving you a little taste of what will come at the next open house. That's basically the question, so what? So yes, we've brought all these flowers here. We can describe the flower abundances and the flower composition of those different meadows. But what does it actually mean to the insects who we're trying to attract? And this is just a couple of pie charts that came from a master's thesis that Erin Allen did with us in 2018. And she did detailed observations of the insects that were coming to the different flowers. And this is just to show which flowers were most visited by bumblebees. So of 551 bumblebees that she observed on flowers during that summer, a quarter of them came to black-eyed Susan, 20% came to wild bergamot, 20% came to New England aster, and these were the other species that were much visited by bumblebees. And if you know those flowers a little bit, they're all large, showy flowers. So we could say that bumblebees are definitely attracted to the flowers that we also find attractive. And it was interesting because honeybees and butterflies had a similar pattern. Now, if one looks at wasps, which are very important in an agricultural context as beneficial insects, because a lot of them are parasitic and help with pest control in the crops, the wasps had a very different preference for flowers. And I would say at least a half, fleabane, horseweed, and Queen Anne's lace, all have tiny, tiny little shallow flowers where the nectar is very easily accessible. And the wasps, most of them are a lot smaller than the yellow jacket you might be thinking of. A lot of the wasps are microscopic. They need small flowers with easily accessible nectar. And so they had a very different preference for flowers, and they almost could have cared less about the showy flowers that we actually seeded. So that was maybe we could have predicted that, but we didn't. And it was interesting to see the wasps telling us that that flower-rich meadow that we seeded was actually not their favorite place. And Conrad and Kenny and Dylan are going to talk in a lot more detail about that next time. So our summary for the botany part of the native meadows is that yes, it was totally possible to establish native meadows on former farmland without the use of herbicides. And we were able to maintain them for now 4 years with an effort from between 3 to 9 person-hours per acre per year. Again, the native wildflower species that performed best in those early years were black-eyed Susan, lanceleaf coreopsis, wild bergamot, partridge pea, New England aster, purple coneflower, early goldenrod, and showy goldenrod. I consider those species my workhorses. And then the native grass species that performed best in those early years were switchgrass, Indian grass, big bluestem, Canada wild rye, and autumn bentgrass. There was quite a bit of variation within each set of 3 plots seeded with the same species and otherwise treated the same way. So nature has its way of keeping things interesting. You can't always predict what's going to happen. And the overall flower abundance was highest in the second year and has steadily declined since, while at the same time spreading out a little bit more evenly across the growing season. So that's the end of my presentation. I want to thank you for your attention and for coming tonight. I want to thank the Hudson Valley Farm Hub for giving us the space and the supports to do those experiments. The farmers there who help with the management of the meadows, and Bloomfield, who coordinates all our efforts at the Farm Hub. Kelly Gill, whom I've mentioned already, who was instrumental in helping me design the seed mixes and advising in the early stages of this project. And then all the FEP interns and colleagues who have helped with data collection and management of the meadows, especially Nellie Osto, who has taken on some of the data collecting and has helped greatly with processing all the information and making the charts, and Conrad for roping me into this in the first place. So that's the end of my presentation. Shall I stop sharing the screen?
Yeah, go ahead and share, Claudia.
Yeah, okay. So I hope I didn't totally flatten you guys with all those details, but I think we have good time for discussion, and hopefully you have many interesting questions, and if we're lucky, I have a few answers too.
Go ahead, Jennifer. Looks like Jennifer has her hand up.
Oh, thank you. Well, I had 2 quick questions, Claudia. One just comment that you noticed the decline, and last summer was so dry. I mean, it was record dry on my side of the river anyway.
Right.
Do you think that might have had something to do with the decline in flowers? Or?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, but it was interesting that the second year was definitely a peak, and the third year was not so dry, and the flower abundance was going down. So I think in some ways we've probably totally overdone it with those black-eyed Susan and lanceleaf coreopsis, and I think wildflower seed mixes often have those early stunners in them to give people sort of an instant gratification or the feeling of success. In terms of what those flowers, what that huge abundance of flowers was actually doing in the ecosystem, I'm not quite sure. We might have just saturated all the insects, and above a certain amount of flowers, it just might not make a difference for the insects. So.
Well, actually, yeah, that leads to my second question, which was, when you did the counts of which flowers were you noted as most attractive to the insects, did you control for the number of flowers out there? Because you like black-eyed Susan, for example, was one of the ones that you got a lot of visits by the bees.
Right.
But there were a lot of them out there too. So how did you kind of handle the fact that flower?
Yeah. Conrad, remind me, when we created those pie diagrams, I don't think we accounted for abundance of flowers. We just took the straight observations from Erin, right?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, super exciting work. I'm pleased to see how successful it was, because I've heard that it's really hard to establish wildflower meadows, and I'm going to use clear plastic to solarize about a 500-foot row, about 8 feet wide, that divides 2 fields, where next year I'll try to establish.
Yeah.
both flowering bushes, but also wildflower perennials. And I have such a mugwort problem that I need to be really serious about controlling all that mugwort before I get started. So, but
Yeah.
very wonderful to see your success.
Yeah, and I think from our smaller scale wildflower patches that we've established here at Hudson Valley, we also worked with solarizing, but don't rely only on the solarizing. Make sure to do some tillage and really stir up the soil because the grassroots just stay so viable that the perennial grasses come in real quick again if you don't.
So after you solarize, then you do some of those pulling out all those roots. Okay. Good.
Yeah. Yeah. And you might actually do some tilling and then solarize again. So when the wheat seeds germinate, they get boiled. So yeah, definitely, I think it's definitely a good plan to take a year to prep your area before putting the seeds down.
Mm-hmm.
Susan, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, so as you know, I have a new construction and all the topsoil's been pushed aside. They'll be bringing that topsoil back in. Am I going to have to, I mean, what are your thoughts about how I prep that soil if I want to try a meadow?
Yeah. So the topsoil was just basically scraped off field.
Yes, it was taken out of, you know, to create the foundation that was pulled out and then was pushed aside, and the plan is to bring it back in shortly.
Yeah, I would watch what happens. So shortly, meaning like within the next month, or?
Yeah, probably May, June, maybe June.
Yeah. Yeah, June is probably a little bit late to seed it with the native wildflowers. So you might want to think of some sort of a cover, like a oat or buckwheat summer cover crop for it, and then seed them in the fall, and see how it goes next year. And it's not going to be without any weeds, but I think you have a good chance of getting something established there.
Right. Just one other question. As you're seeing the flowering wildflowers peter out, what about reseeding or putting, you know, do you have, I mean, what were the thoughts about what you were going to do to bring the flowers back?
You know, at this point, I think the amount of flowers that we have is still a lot more than in the surrounding agricultural areas. So it's still adding a resource to the farm and a biodiversity hotspot in a way. So I'm not too worried about, I mean, on those charts, it looked pretty extreme, but when you're out there in the middle of the summer, there are still a lot of flowers. So I'm not worried about the number of flowers at this point. What I'm a little bit worried about is the wild bergamot's tendency of becoming more and more abundant. And there we will have to see if that tendency continues. We might start doing some selective cutting or weeding, or maybe we'll just let it go and document how it continues, because it is an experiment after all. So we wouldn't want to spend too much time managing, because that's not what a farmer would do. So we haven't decided yet how we're going to react. It's going to be adaptive management depending on what presents itself to us.
Okay, thank you.
If anybody just wants to jump in, you should feel free. You don't need to raise your hand. I don't even know how to raise a hand anyway.
I have a question. Wendy speaking. Maybe I didn't understand, but your control plot with the flower density of wild species, that seemed pretty high, or what I remember as high.
It was not the flower density, it was the diversity of flowers. So we have a little bit of a lot of different species, but overall they don't amount to a lot of flowers.
And that came in with the fallow field just on its own.
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, were they invasive or native or grasses or mixtures?
It's a wild mix of stuff. We have everything from a little bit of poison ivy, purple loosestrife, St. John's wort, a lot of horseweed, which is a native. What else are, oh, there's, they're like the little, what was that?
Was mugwort one of the things in that one?
Oh, yes, mugwort. Thank you for reminding me. Yes, mugwort is coming.
It's everywhere. It might be interesting to see the creatures, the insects, and the, you know, those, how they like that field in relationship to the other plots.
Yeah, that's what Conrad and Dylan and Kenny are going to talk about at the next open house.
I congratulate you on all your efforts. It's a really good document because everybody wants this and they don't understand the fluctuation and waiting. And this will be really a wonderful tool for people down the road.
Thank you. Yeah.
One more question, if I may.
Sure.
Okay, so meadow, quote unquote, there's this idea with a lot of septic system, leach fields, like 40 by 60, 80 by 120, and I don't want lawn. The situation with little blue stem or meadow grasses, they have a deep taproot, which will affect the piping for the leach system. So down the road, you know, we can talk about it more. There might be different ways. Everyone's probably not interested, but it's interesting because so much space is mowed lawn because of these leach fields when people want meadows. So there might be another short rooted system that won't destroy the piping to make the system work. It's an interesting quandary because it's a huge space and who wants mowed lawn? Or well, you know, everywhere. So, okay, just put that out there if anyone has any brilliant ideas.
Yeah, that's actually a really good idea. And I have to admit that I have not looked at the roots of my wildflowers at all. And it's actually an interesting question that came up from Carmen, the professor who is looking at the macroinvertebrates in the soil, because she is wondering how the below ground characteristics of different species might impact who the little critters are that live in the soil. And we might start looking a little bit into what the root systems look like. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Claudia, I came late, so you might have described this early on. I'm curious, did you collect the data? What were your protocols to collect the data? Was it a number of transects through the meadows, or?
So we did square plots, 1 foot square for the plant composition. So we did 2 transects through each of the plots with evenly spaced little square samples.
Yeah.
And we estimated the percent cover that each species was taking up in those little squares. And for the flower abundance, we had a larger circular plot where we counted all the flowers that were open at the time.
Cool. And the really confusing thing is, if there were 551 bumblebees, how do you not count the same bumblebees like twice or 3 times? Or, I mean, are they all different? I mean, how do you do that? That's very complex, it seems.
Yeah, so that study, that was Erin, a graduate student from SUNY Albany who did that. And she had her protocol where she would walk at a more or less even pace through the meadow and just stop when she was observing something, note down who was where, keep going.
Okay.
So while there could be some repetition, because she was moving through the system, there shouldn't have been too much of it.
I understand. Okay.
So
yeah.
She was trying to cover ground and see different flowers and meet different bumblebees.
Got it. Thanks.
You're welcome. Right. Any more questions that came up?
I had a question actually I wanted to ask about the decision not to use herbicides. And I was wondering if you had any sort of point of comparison and what a field would like this would be like under the use of herbicides, just because in both of the seed mixes, it seemed like the wildflowers took over pretty well after the second season and only started to go down after that. So I was just wondering if you had any examples of that. And then, you know, obviously the cons, anything to do with insects and stuff like that.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I don't actually have any experience myself with establishing, well, maybe fortunately, with establishing a meadow like that with the use of herbicides. I think where herbicides are often used is if you start with a lawn or you start with an old field and you want to create a seed bed without doing a lot of tillage. And because we were starting with a former cornfield and those things were tilled, that was, yeah, and the machines were on the farm, we had the option to just go back in and till a couple of times more and create the bare soil that way. And then the other place where the herbicides come in, of course, is with the selective elimination of things like mugwort. Which are definitely trying to move into our meadows. And we did spend a bit of time last year. Nellie was working hard on just basically selectively cutting them down. She was in there with the weed whacker, just cutting down those mugwort patches to avoid them taking up too much space and going to seed. And if people were to work with herbicides, they probably would go in and herbicide those plots, those patches. But yeah, we did not do that comparison in terms of what it does for the insects, in terms of what it does labor-wise, and in terms of what it does to the vegetation. That would be really interesting.
Yeah, thank you. I was just curious because it seemed very successful even without the herbicide.
Yeah, it's doable.
Definitely.
And we were on an organic farm, and so we couldn't actually use herbicides. And it was partially to see if farmers who are farming organically could also think about putting in these meadows, because I think NRCS in their instructions just talks about, well, you use herbicides. And so it's a little bit, in some ways, kind of a little bit unfriendly if you're an organic farmer.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, you were right on the floodplain, right next to the creek. You don't want herbicides there, I don't think.
No.
The bergamot really does take over.
So you have had that experience as well?
There's a certain character in Spencertown that has a native meadow that the bergamot took over, or the Monarda took over completely. And I'm like, cut that down periodically, because it was literally all became the whole dense thing. Will be interesting in a different situation what happens.
Yeah. So did you come up with a mowing regime for the whole meadow that would discourage the wild bergamot, or are you just going in and selectively cutting it down?
I sort of was a sidebar on that. It's I don't do the work there anymore. It was more an observation when I visited. I wonder if you were to use the mountain mint or another mint that takes that's a mint in the mint family. I wonder what that relation, if the who would have hierarchy, you know.
We did have the narrow-leafed mountain mint in the seed mix, and it almost did not come through at all.
I didn't see it hardly. Yeah, okay. That's the guys, the bergamot's a thug, a serious, you know. But it's good for the insects and everybody.
Yeah, the bumblebees and the butterflies love them.
Yeah, they love it.
Yeah. So I see Bob has a question of where the seed mix came from. I did not specify that, and it was actually not a pre-mixed seed mix. but we customized it. So Ellie and I decided which seeds we wanted in the mix, and then we sourced them from different places. Most of the seeds came from Ernst Seed, which tends to be the cheapest and has a lot of seeds. So usually they can supply a lot. They are down in Pennsylvania. And then there were some species that they did not have available that year, and we sourced them actually all the way out in the Midwest. But there are some good possibilities closer by. I hear good things about Pinelands Nursery in New Jersey. And if you want smaller amounts of seeds, there's also a nice project that's called the Wild Seed Project up in Maine. They do a lot of wild collecting of seeds and propagating. Yeah, so those are some possibilities. But if you need a lot of seeds, Ernst Seed seems to be a good option. All right. Oh, and there was the question if black plastic would take care of the mugwort. Yeah, maybe. The problem is a little bit that it's growing in these small patches inside our meadow, and to place black plastic in relatively small areas and keeping it in place would be a little bit of a challenge. Yeah, we have not tried that. We're still trying to just mow it down and give other plants space to take over. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I guess based on the patterns you've seen so far, what are you expecting to happen to the meadow composition, more long term?
Yeah, I mean, what Wendy is saying now that she has seen the wild bergamot take over meadows in other places, that is definitely one possibility. I think with the grass ridge mix, I think the flowering plants are going to become less and less, and it will become more of a straight grass plant community. With the flower-rich seed mix, I fear that the wild bergamot might be taking over, but I'm still holding my breath too, because obviously the dry summer this year did not do well with that, and depending on what the weather does, other species might get a boost. So we'll see.
Have you tried to kind of keep more close track of the weather, year to year, to have like a month to month thing so that you can compare that way as well? Or is it more anecdotal?
No, there is a weather station at the Farm Hub. We have not.
Oh, awesome.
We have not dug up those data, but they are available. And yeah, that's maybe something that you can jump in when you get here. There's a lot that could still happen with those data. So yeah, I'm curious. I'm looking forward to sitting down with you and just discussing the other ways we can look at those data, and also how we can visualize them.
Yeah, for sure. I have one more question,
if
that's okay. So you're saying that kind of one possibility is to have a lot more of the bergamot or a lot of grasses. What would be the implications for that, maybe for the other organisms?
Well, I mean, Conrad and Kenny and Dylan will continue to monitor the invertebrate communities in those meadows, and we will see what the implications are. I could predict, yeah, I'm not sure what I can predict. I mean, wild bergamot has this clear flowering peak in the middle of the season, and then not so much later on. And actually, thinking about it now, I think the goldenrods and the New England aster are also pretty aggressive. and maybe the wild bergamot, the goldenrod, and the New England aster are going to fight it out amongst each other and are going to sort of come to some sort of equilibrium. And then we will continue to have those two peaks of flowers, one in midsummer and one in late fall. And I think between them, they can still provide a lot of nectar and other flower resources to a lot of insects. And yeah, I don't have a very precise prediction. I'm just looking forward to documenting what happens and then be able to look back after 10 years and say, yep, this is what happened.
Let the plant speak.
Yes, and the insects.
I wouldn't take that bergamot comment by me as gospel. It was like one or two examples. And I think with the asters, and as you say, the goldenrod, once they become more established, they'll have more of a fighting chance.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Oh, one more thing. I was surprised about the little blue stem, the purple top, and the purple love. The grasses, they didn't do very well in any of the plots.
They didn't do very well in the grass-rich seed mix. And I think that is because switchgrass and big blue stem are tall and dense, and they just push the other guys out. The little blue stem did well in the wildflower rich seed mix, where it was the only grass and it could sort of establish itself between the wildflowers.
Thank you. Yeah. I love your work. I'm so respectful or thankful for it because we need it.
Oh, Wendy, you're such a fan. It's really nice to have you here. And I'm learning a lot from you, so it's
good work. It's necessary work. That's why it's not, just a fan. I can't do everything, so I'm glad there's other people doing all this. I learn.
Yep, and so do I from you. So it's nice.
Thank you.
You're welcome, Wendy.
He's asking about pH differences from plot to plot.
Basically none, Lee, because this farm, it was managed as a conventional, mostly sweet corn farm until 2013, I think, and they had maintained their soils. I mean, they had done soil tests every year and just maintained them at ideal conditions for the agricultural crops. So it was all the pH was perfect and for the corn, and nutrient status was perfect. And we did do soil tests the first 2 years, and there were no big differences yet. And then last year we didn't do them because of COVID, and then this year we're going to do them again. So we will see if 4 years down the line the plots start diverging a little bit, because we haven't done any fertilizing since we established the meadows. But so far we could not document any differences.
Wendy has one more question if there's time.
It looks like it.
So in the spring, when you cut down, you let the all the foliage, everything left until the spring cutting down.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is it hard because you do that when it's just frozen or before the last frost or so you can get the equipment in there not compacting, or when the soil's wet? In the spring, it's tricky.
Yeah, those soils are not bad. They drain well. And the way the Farm Hub works, they have their machines asleep over the winter, and then mid-March they get pulled out. And so actually this year the mowing just happened late last week. So it was it wouldn't have been ideal on a soil that's very prone to compaction, but I don't think our soils are so susceptible to that.
Thank you.
Last chance for questions. Or if there are no more, well,
Somebody actually just joined.
oh, well, welcome.
Welcome, but we're at the end of the talk.
Yeah.
Susan has her hand up.
Yeah, there was one wildflower seed company that you didn't mention. I don't know whether it's just in the one in Vermont. I think it's where is it? Not near Shelburne, but I think it's called the Wildflower Farm.
Okay.
Do you know of them or no?
I might have looked into them at some point, but for some reason, maybe they were just a little bit more expensive than the other ones. I decided not to work with them.
Okay.
Yeah, I think if you're talking about acres and acres of wildflowers, the price really does make a difference.
Right,
And the larger companies can just be cheaper because they work with economy of scale.
So when you spoke with Ernst, did you ask them, like, you get a sack of seed and I want X amount of this seed, and then, I mean, did they mix it for you, or did you have to create your own mix?
You can ask them to go either way. I asked them to keep them separate because we were working with this machine that actually has 3 different seed boxes depending on the size of the seeds. And so I wanted to just combine the seeds that were compatible for each of the seed boxes. But you can ask them to mix the seeds too if you want to hand broadcast them. That might be the nicer way of doing it. They charge a little extra for mixing them.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There are some questions in the chat, Claudia.
Oh, let me see. Huh. Wouldn't you save more seed by mowing in the fall? But I'm not quite sure how you mean that question. I mean, we actually want our meadows to be a food source for overwintering birds, so they come and eat seeds. I don't think we need a lot more seeds in the meadow right now because the perennial plants are well established, and we're not collecting seeds from the meadows. We could do that, but then we could still let them stand into the winter. Yeah, I don't know if you want to.
You don't think you're losing a lot of seed by letting it stand?
I mean, we're losing them to the birds, but
that's one of your objectives anyway.
That's one of our objectives, yeah.
Okay.
And as I say, because the plants are perennials, we're not relying on the meadow reseeding itself to a large extent. I mean, some of that is happening, but it's not a big important thing.
There was the question about soil testing to show, any soil testing to show residual herbicides affecting broadleaf plants? You want to take that, Claudia?
Well, I don't think we have looked for herbicides, right?
Yeah. No, we haven't. I mean, as Claudia said, they probably wouldn't have been applied for at least, what, 5, 8 years, something like that. But
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, Jennifer is saying, be careful not to let the buckwheat go to seed. When I was recommending to Susan that she could put buckwheat on her newly spread topsoil. But I don't know. I think if a little bit of buckwheat goes to seed and comes back the next year, that's not a big deal because eventually it will get pushed.
we might have lost Claudia. Is anybody else here? Claudia?
I'm here, but Claudia seems to be gone.
Yeah. Claudia. Let me go and let her know that she's not being heard.
Again. Here I am again. Sorry, I had gotten disconnected again. My internet seems to be a little bit finicky today. So I hope we've addressed all the questions that
there was one more question at the end.
Oh. My chat is actually empty now because I came in again. Can you read it, Conrad?
The Danilevskis were asking, wouldn't you say that the control plot is the real natural meadow, what the land wants to be?
Yes and no. I mean, it's what the land wants to be after having been farmed for 3 generations and having accumulated a seed bank of agricultural weeds that have benefited from growing with the corn and the soybeans. So it's kind of an artificial situation too, in a way. And really, it's kind of tricky to speak of native meadows in our region and in our climate, because the native vegetation here really wants to be forest, and that's why the cottonwood is coming into our meadows. And native meadows, pre-colonial, were probably very limited to situations where heavy natural disturbance avoided forests from growing, like in floodplains with frequent flooding, or around areas where there is frequent fires, in beaver meadows where the beavers had taken care of the forest and made a pond, and then it was going back into a meadow. That's where you naturally had meadows in the environment here. And then of course Native Americans might have created some meadows too, but we are not a prairie climate here. So when we talk of native meadows, we really should be saying meadows composed of native plants, because the meadow is not a very native thing here. And why we still feel that, why it is that we still feel that they have a space in our landscape, is because agriculture has opened up a lot of forest, and there is a lot of open land that we use for food production. And we see a possibility for shaping some farmland, former farmland, into open areas that adds native plants that otherwise would have been like in forest gaps or around formerly burned areas, to bring those back into the landscape and give them some space too, and with that make the farms more diverse places. So yeah, talking about native meadows is actually a little bit sloppy, because there were very few native meadows as we understand it in our region. I don't know, did that answer the question?
Thank you, yes.
And of course, in a landscaping situation, a meadow composed of native plants is a much more diverse and life-sustaining situation than a mowed lawn that's composed of a single grass that never flowers. So there are justifications for creating those meadows, even if they were not part of the native ecosystem here.
Right.
All right, we're approaching 8 o'clock, and I would say If there are
Thank
no
you very
more,
much.
yeah, I thank you for your patience and interest, and I hope it was a little helpful and inspiring. And if you have any questions, please shoot them on over by email or give a call, and I'll try to answer them. Yeah, and it's been nice seeing some of you, hearing some of you, and knowing that some others of you were there. And have a good night.
Have a good night. Thank you very much.
Night.
Good night. Thank you.
Good
Always
night.
helpful and inspiring.
Good.
Are we in camera?